We don't know the agenda of the cabinet meeting today, Mr. President, but we had hoped that this latest legislative item would get lost in the shuffle.
It's our idea, Mr. President, that we nail this thing right there on the floor. Not sending it to committee or any place else, but open it up for a full discussion, and very soon.
Gentlemen, I'm told by the majority leader that passage of the minorities' rehabilitation bill is practically assured.
We're not talking about the minorities' rehabilitation bill, Mr. President. We're talking about the Watson bill.
The Watson bill? I'm afraid that one eludes me. Perhaps you'd best bring me up to date.
Senator Watson's bill proposes that the president be prohibited from firing any cabinet member without the express approval of Congress.
Which is another way of making damn certain that you don't step out of line.
Or out of place.
Naturally, we assumed that the bill had been brought to your attention.
We also
Mr.
assume that you will publicly call it what it is, an affront.
I'll take a look at it. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for bringing this to my attention.
We were discussing the possibility of a strike by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. We were discussing the possibility of a strike by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers.
Can you table that for a moment, Mr. Eaton? I've just been given to understand that Senator Watson is planning to introduce a bill on the floor of the Senate next week. It will prohibit the president from firing any cabinet member without the express approval of Congress. You gentlemen know about that? Any of you?
Well, Mr. President.
Odds are, Mr. President, that that bill will be sent directly to committee. And I doubt very seriously whether it will come up for a vote in either house while you're still in office. Therefore, it seems to me that any discussion of it at this time is totally irrelevant.
That bill is aimed at me, Mr. Eaton, like a harpoon. Considering what little weight I bring to bear on this body, it's like trying to shoot down a fly with heavy artillery. All things considered, Mr. Eaton, it is my presence here that's irrelevant.
Excuse me, Mr. President. The press conference, sir, they're waiting for you. And Mr. Eaton suggested you browsed over this also. And he wanted to make sure you'd read his other notes.
I've read his notes by the hour. He writes voluminous marginal commentary. Now I see he's even asterisked all those questions he'd prefer I not answer. Huh? He's done everything but supply me with the gestures and facial expressions.
Well, I'm sure, Mr. Eaton. Well, that is, I think I know what he had in mind, sir.
Don't be embarrassed, Mrs. Bloor. I understand Secretary of State Eaton's function. And I understand mine.
The way I want him is tactful, discreet, and non-controversial. Now, can I expect all three?
No reason.
I think the president is on his way now. If you'll take your seats, the press conference will be beginning in a few minutes.
Mr. President, if I could have about 15 seconds of your time.
What's that?
Makeup, sir.
Wouldn't help.
Follow it. Follow it closer. Ready? Take it. One, break the full shot. Pick it up on the CME. Take two. Cue the announcer.
Ladies and gentlemen,
President
of the
United States.
All right, gentlemen. I'm at your disposal, and ladies.
Mr. President, Mr. President.
Pierce. It is Mr. Pierce, isn't it?
It's New York Times, Mr. President. The minorities rehabilitation bill that's just come out of committee, there's been some pressure to table it. Your view on that, Mr. President?
The bill in question is a sizable step towards social progress in this country. It has my support, and when it reaches my desk, I'll sign it.
What if it's tabled?
Pardon?
What if it's tabled?
I don't anticipate that happening. Yes.
Haley, Mr. President, San Francisco Chronicle. Senator Watson has introduced legislation
that requires consent of Congress before a president can fire a cabinet member. What's your comment on that?
I have no comment. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. President, I'm Amanda Smelker, Midwest Newspaper Association.
Yes, Mrs. Smoke.
Only one of our presidents have been unmarried. That was James Buchanan, our 15th president. And, of course, some have married in the White House after they took office.
That's a very interesting answer, Mrs. Smoker. Now, how about your question?
Well, you are, of course, a widower, and I was wondering if it had crossed your mind to enter the state of matrimony during your term of office, and if the answer is affirmative, could you tell us specifically who you had in mind?
You may quote me, Mrs. Smoker. I should like very much at some time to remarry. I have no one in mind, but if you have someone, you can remain after this conference and we can jot down a list of names.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Gilbert, Mr. President, Chicago Tribune. The South Africans, as of yesterday afternoon, claim we have knowledge of the whereabouts of an American citizen who attempted to assassinate the South African...
Alleged, Mr. Gilbert.
An American who's alleged to have attempted to assassinate the South African Minister of Defense, Mr. Vanderbilt. My question, Mr. President, is, do we actually know where this American is? And if he is in the United States, is it your intention to hand him over?
Mr. President, forgive me, sir. Mr. President, do you have all of the questions and all of the answers on that paper there?
First of all, you haven't identified yourself.
My name is Webson, Mr. President. I represent the Negro Press International. I apologize to Mr. Gilbert for interfering with his questioning. But what I'd like to know is this a press conference? Or is it just a prepared news handout spoken out loud?
I don't think
Any of my responses displease you, Mr.?
Well, I'm not here to get pleased, Mr. President. But I am here to hear what the President of the United States has to say about the issue. Pollution bill, pact with the Chinese, the minorities rehabilitation legislation, and is there the possibility of a black kid being sent back to the lily-white South African Republic to get lynched? Well, forgive me, sir, but we want to hear responses to the question. Your responses, Mr. President, not some committee notes that have been fed to you before we were invited in here.
Please, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Webson, some 2 weeks ago, I made a public statement concerning the South African situation. At that time, I said that any move toward extradition would not come by an executive order, but would be handled by the State Department, and the situation called for it by the Justice Department.
Mr. President, an identical statement came from Secretary of State Eden. I would like to hear from you, Mr. President, how you feel about it.
All right, Mr. Webson. No notes, no cues, hints, or preset suggestions. Now, what is it you have on your mind?
The ambassador of the South African Republic claims that you'd make it your business to prevent extradition of a black American simply because he is black.
I said publicly 2 weeks ago that I would serve in a consultative capacity if the question of extradition came up.
The South Africans also made a public statement that the word consultative was a euphemism.
Yes, I read their statement.
But you didn't publicly comment on it.
Well, I'll publicly comment on it now. According to the South Africans, they have just jailed several hundred people for the violation of their Sabotage Act, their Suppression of Communism Act, and their Unlawful Organization Act. Under the umbrella of this sizable security apparatus, they now hold something in the neighborhood of 1,000 people, most of them black, most of them held incommunicado, and they have repeatedly assured us this is not barbarism, this is simply discipline. So in the matter of euphemisms, Mr. Webson, I bow to the South Africans.
Mr. President, perhaps I can clarify that somewhat for the members of the press.
What I just said, Mr. Eaton, doesn't require any clarification. Now, Mr. Webson and everyone else, write this down verbatim, if you will. The respective colors of the victim and his alleged assailant are a matter of indifference to me, I can assure you that if the intended victim had been a Nigerian ambassador, 3 shades blacker than I am, and his assailant, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, I would still direct the Justice Department to examine all the facts before we arbitrarily throw an American citizen into jeopardy.
Mr. President, are you suggesting, Mr. President, that this American, whoever he is, if tried in South Africa, he could expect something less than a fair trial?
Something considerably less, yes, Mr. Pierce. I think he'd be prejudged and officially lynched. Now, Mr. Webson, since you broached it originally, let me admit to you that in the short time allotted to me as president, I may never learn the subtleties of foreign relations, but like you, several hundred years of history have made me an expert on lynching.
Thank you, Mr. President. You've said it all.